Good morning and welcome to the Thursday, February 17th, 2022 edition of the National Newspaper Publishers Association's Let It Be Known. Standing your ground while black. That's what we're talking about this morning. White aggressors have restyled themselves as the ones needing the protection. But what happens when a black person has to stand their ground? Let's discuss this morning with Dr. Akin Houston, Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies at Ohio University, Attorney Richard Rice of the Rice Law Firm in Alabama, and Ray Green Jr., the Executive Director of the Freedom Bloc in Ohio, will join us. But first, of course, the headlines to start your day this morning. A Massachusetts Montessori daycare and preschool has temporarily shut down after a teacher had toddlers make and wear black face masks as a part of Black History Month. The school has since deactivated its Facebook page and posted a statement on the door saying the teacher involved was fired. To celebrate Black History Month, a teacher in toddler classrooms at IC Kids planned and carried out an activity that involved black mask, black face. One of the parents brought it to our attention and was offended. The teacher apologized to the parent, according to the statement from the school. Got toddlers in blackface. Dr. Chavez always says that racism is taught behavior, and this is a prime example, unfortunate example. Also in the news this morning, New Jersey police are under fire for their response to a fistfight after a black eighth grader was pinned to the ground and handcuffed while a white teen involved in the mall scuffle was left seated on a couch. The fight, which took place at Bridgewater Commons in Bridgewater Township, New Jersey, was captured on video and prompted a review of the officer's conduct as well as strong words from the governor. Video footage of the incident shows a group of young people gathered in a seating area at the mall, and two boys, one white and one black, standing up in a verbal altercation. Kai, the name of the 14-year-old black teenager, said the dispute started when he stood up to the other boy, who is older, for picking on his friend. Kai says he was kind of saying like, "You're a little kid, you're my little pet," and stuff like that. The confrontation escalated with the two throwing punches at each other as onlookers shouted, according to the video. After several seconds of punching, two uniformed officers with the Bridgewater Police Department ran onto the scene and pulled the two apart. One officer pushed the white teen into a seated position on the couch, while Kai, already on the ground, was pinned down onto his stomach by a male officer, with the officer's knee appearing to be on the teen's back. A female officer then helped, placing her knee near the back of Kai's neck as they put him in handcuffs, according to the video clip. A person in the background is heard saying, "This is because he's black. It's racially motivated." The white teen also appeared to be left alone and at one point stood up and looked over the scene as the two officers restrained Kai. On being restrained by the officers, Kai said, "I was like calm because I knew not to be scared. Just stay calm and not move and do what they tell me to do." Out of the mouths of babes. This is something that we certainly will continue to look after. And I'm sure our Let It Be Known legal analyst, Robert Tarver of the Tarver Law Firm in New Jersey, will have a lot to say on this in the coming days. So we will reach out to Attorney Tarver on this. But this morning, we talk about standing your ground while black. In 1892, at the height of the lynching crisis, Ida B. Wells proclaimed that a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give. When the white man, who is always the aggressor, knows he runs as great a risk of biting the dust every time his Afro-American victim does, he will have greater respect for African-American life, Ida B. Wells said. The critical point, though, in her manifesto for Black self-defense is not her respect for the power of guns. It is her observation about where the aggression begins. Losing that thread of the argument about who actually starts the fights is the reason so much white aggression is seamlessly restyled as the right to stand one's ground, to protect and defend. Conversely, Black self-defense is transposed into an act of unjustified aggression and met with fire and fury by both the state and self-deputized white citizens. Let's discuss that this morning with Dr. Akin Houston, the Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies at Ohio University, Attorney Richard Wright of the Rice Firm in Alabama, and Ray Green, the Executive Director of the Freedom Bloc in Akron. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to first start with you, Dr. Houston, because we know these stand your ground laws have mostly benefited white folks, and Black folks have a hard time using these laws. Tell us a little bit of background on stand your ground and how it pertains to African Americans.
Sure. Thank you for the question, and good morning, everyone. So stand your ground. Ideally, there is a piece that's missing in current discussions, and that is the duty to retreat. If you can reasonably get yourself out of harm's way, there is an expectation that you will do so. However, many states, including Ohio and Florida, have changed the stand your ground law, which makes it a little bit fuzzier in terms of the particulars of what someone can and is expected to do. And it gives the attacker in many instances more latitude to use force, deadly force in many instances. So there's this interesting history with stand your ground when it comes to Black folk. Although there is a law, we understand and know from lived experience that it doesn't often evenly apply to us, despite which side we are on. And there are a number of recent cases that show this sort of disparity when it comes to Black and brown folks who have attempted to use stand your ground as a defense. So a couple of things here. One, the law has not really been written and designed with us in mind. And two, the impact of the law has had a deleterious effect on Black lives and brown communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mr. Green, you have been a big advocate on this issue for Black America. Tell us about what you have encountered in Ohio.
What I've encountered is what we've just seen with this police officer immediately singling out the Black kid. Black people are often looked at as the aggressor. In any situation like this, the Black people are looked at as the aggressor. So we're never given the benefit of the doubt. I've watched white men walk down the street with guns and no one says anything because this is an open and carry state. But Black people can't do the same thing. We are always considered the aggressor. We are always considered to not have gun rights. So what I've encountered is a nation, a country, a state that is afraid of Black people. And this law was enacted to equip white people with the ability to kill Black people on sight because of that inherent fear.
Yeah. And so I want to now go to Attorney Rice, because Attorney Rice, you had a case with an African-American woman who was a stand your ground case. And I know you probably had to, from all I've read, you had to go about that more forcefully and in a different way than when white people use the stand your ground statute.
Yes, and good morning. Thanks for the question. I mean, as the other panelists have stated, racial bias permeates in every facet of our society, and certainly in, oftentimes in the legislative drafting process. But then also, once the law is applied, there's always a subjective factor to determine whether or not the specific immunity that stand your ground laws authorize applies in a particular case. And so one of the panelists, Mr. Green, mentioned, instances in which there may be, a Black victim, if you will, and a white aggressor in those situations. And that's kind of a clear case for us to be able to see how that bias can play out. But even when you have a situation involving two African Americans, such as the case that you mentioned, where we had a young lady who had been the victim of domestic abuse over a period of time, and she had been involved in a relationship off and on with a young man who had a checkered past, criminal history, including violence, and on one particular occasion had engaged in domestic violence against her, left the house. They called the police. He wasn't home. He came back later that morning, and she had to defend herself and her family. She had her kids in the home as well. She fired the gun one time, and it was a fatal shot. And in that type of case, what you see typically is that if you are a first line investigator, a detective on the scene, then you have the capacity in that situation to write the report, right? And in that situation, when you're writing the report, that is going to be the first line of defense, if you will, so to speak, in terms of determining who's right, who's wrong, whether there is immunity that'll apply or whether there is culpability, criminal liability that should apply in that situation. So even the initial detective there, so the race of that person, their cultural experiences, all of those things will, have some type of influence or impact on whether or not stand your ground would be evenly applied. And then, of course, we know that there would be ongoing investigation from a district attorney, from a lead investigator, and then ultimately a grand jury would decide if the detective or the prosecutor chose to present the case to a grand jury, then that grand jury would decide whether or not to indict an individual in that situation. And so we know that oftentimes there's all types of racial bias in a grand jury. And then ultimately, if your case were to proceed to a formal trial, if you were indicted, then once again, that case will be decided by a jury. In Alabama, we also have an opportunity to request what's called a stand your ground hearing. And so that's essentially, a mini trial that would be decided by a judge. So again, you have an opportunity for bias or cultural racial bias to kind of infiltrate the process as well.
Yeah, and Mr. Green, what do you tell African Americans about stand your ground? That what they should know, because you can't just say, "Well, I'm standing my ground." There are some nuances, right? Yeah, I think you're on mute. There you go.
Okay, sorry about that. What we try to do is equip people with the knowledge of the law, understand the law, understand the gun laws, but also understand who you are and where you're at. Understand that this law is not for Black people. It's not for the protection of Black people. Understand that guns are not to be used in arguments or altercations like that. Guns have a specific use in our society and in our community, and that's to protect our families and also for sport. And we just need to understand that inside of our communities, understand our surroundings, and don't fall into being provoked by someone that looks like us or someone that doesn't look like us. And just understand the gun laws inside of our state and inside of our city limits.
Yeah, and so, Dr. Houston, do you find that even at school, do you find students, Black students in particular, understanding the law?
Are very skillful at understanding the law. The part that they struggle with is that the law doesn't evenly apply. So when you look at different situations, some of my students who believe the myth of post-racial bliss are confused that the law doesn't apply to them in the same way it does to our less melanated brothers and sisters. So the challenge is, things that many Black folks have known and grown up hearing from their ancestors, their elders, is that, you can't do what other people do. And there's a different responsibility that you have when you leave this house. So I think for a lot of students who grew up, under the years of Obama and really believed a lot of stuff that was being said about racial access and equity, they're really struggling with the fact that, no, it's not true. Even after the well-publicized deaths of folks like Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Sandra Bland, and others, they still believe that this law will apply evenly to them, not really realizing that this is a long-standing pattern in U.S. history when it comes to the treatment of Black and brown folks. So I think the students, to their credit, get the law, but probably the failing of this society is that it is not fairly distributed and the treatment is very different.
Yeah, and I want to go back to Attorney Rice because not far from you, there in Alabama, over in Florida, we know the case that really shook us all up with George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. And in that situation there, stand your ground was certainly used. And not only was it used, but later George Zimmerman used that, his so-called innocence to sue the parents of Trayvon Martin. As the suit was just dismissed this week after all these years, but the antagonism that goes along with that when it comes to Black folks is just, what do you say to your clients?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question, and I think that the panelists again have really, hit the nail on the head in just terms of what do you tell someone when your mere existence, just your appearance, is suspicious activity, and you're giving someone justification for feeling threatened and intimidated by a teenage boy, who's just doing something we all did. You look forward to going to the corner store and picking up some candy and juice or Coke or whatever the case may be. And that's suspicious activity, yet it's common to all of us, right? So, what I have to try to do to balance, I'm an officer of the court. I'm a licensed attorney in Alabama. And so we have, an uphill challenge. And I tell my clients that, and I tell the public, as a public interest attorney, when I'm speaking, that you may have a right to use reasonable force to resist an arrest in Alabama, but how prudent of a decision is that? Is that something that you would want to argue with the police officer who is suspecting you of something suspicious or deeming you a threat at the time? Or is that an argument that you would rather, save and argue in a courtroom, with other witnesses there and a jury and a judge as well? And so it's always a balance in saying, yes, you need to know your rights, but it's a matter of strategically asserting them in a way that's smart and prudent. And so I always try to caution, my clients and the public, again, to be assertive in their rights, but also do so in a way that's going to be safe for them as well.
Yeah, and this is for the panel. Lisa Caluet writes in that why is it that laws don't apply to us on one hand, then other laws apply to only us? I'm sure you hear that a lot.
Yeah, that's true. And, and again, if you look at just the history of this country in terms of who's prosecuted and the proportion of, looking at the state of Alabama, the proportion, I think African Americans represent about 30% of the general population in the state of Alabama, yet we represent over 50% of the incarcerated population. And so this is something that we have to address. Some people are tired of talking about it. They think that this topic is coming up too much in sports and other activities that, have typically been used maybe for entertainment solely, or maybe even escaping from reality. But I just think until we actually address the issue at the root, at the core, then we'll continue to see these type of disparities. And there's no real, it's not an easy way or nice way to talk about it. It is what it is, and we have to address it. And the objective data tells the story, better than I could.
Yeah, and so Mr. Green at the Freedom Block, what goes on there? Give the audience just a brief overview of the Freedom Block and how you guys got involved in this debate or this concern of stand your ground.
Those that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So we believe that we have to be involved in politics in order for these things to change. So what we do is we do leadership development. Our main thing is leadership development. We develop leaders out of people's direct pain, out of our direct pain. And this stand your ground was one of the things that we used to develop leaders out of, helping people understand the law, helping people understand the criminal justice system, helping people understand how do we elect judges and prosecutors and how that affects our communities. And that's how we got involved in this fight for stand your ground, to end this, because we knew this was disproportionately killed us. But we have to develop leaders on the ground that can tell their neighbors and talk to their neighbors and talk to their peers about going out to vote against bills like this, but also running for office, to being able to change the law, ensure that this never hits the table. And that's what we do here at the Freedom Block. We educate our community and develop leaders around issues like this.
Yeah, and of course, speaking of education, I know Dr. Houston, in your profession, you have a certain curriculum that you follow, but I'm sure that you get a lot of things like this from African American students in particular. You probably get a lot of questions about why are the laws so different, and even here we are in 2022. And yet we're talking as if it was 1962.
Absolutely. And, from this perspective, one of the things we could do is institutionalize African-American studies. Far too many students come to college without any knowledge of African-American history, experience. They may know Rosa refused to give up her seat and Martin had a dream, and that's the extent of it. And so we can certainly do a better job equipping all students with the knowledge of the past. One of our current challenges is the real hard push against critical race theory and anything, frankly, having to do with the critical understanding of the past that makes people uncomfortable. And as the other panelists have pointed out, this isn't going to be an easy conversation, but it's necessary in order to directly address the problem and the challenge. So in my field, that's one of the challenges, is getting people to the table to have honest and frank conversations to see that, no, this isn't an aberration. This is a long running theme in US history, and the laws in many instances have been used to circumvent African-American participation. So just when Black folks think that they have arrived and they can participate, there have been methods, legal and extra legal, to prevent them from accessing any form of consistent justice.
Yeah, and you mentioned some key words there, and Attorney Rice, I know that on this program, Dr. Chavis and others talk often about the need to change not just the system itself. Obviously, there's a need for that, but judges and prosecutors, and you mentioned grand juries earlier. That is vital too, because who are on grand juries for the most part?
For the most part, you're going to see overrepresentation of Caucasian white Americans, and typically it's going to be folks that are property owners as well. And I think that just leads to even more disparity. And what I would also add to that is that these grand jury proceedings are they're sealed. There's information on how the case is presented to the grand jury is such a critical component. So, for instance, if I am a district attorney or a prosecutor in a particular case, my tone of voice, the evidence that I lead with, what am I presenting first to you as a grand juror? How am I presenting it? Am I presenting it in a repeated fashion? What elements of the evidence am I leaving out? What am I highlighting? All of these things are going to factor into how I impress upon your mind the type of story, the narrative, the picture that I'm painting for you, which is obviously going to determine, what type of decision you choose to make as to whether to indict. And so I think that we certainly need more transparency with the grand jury process. That's just a key element to every other facet of our society in a democratic society. So I think that, as the other panelists have spoken about, we do need to have a more critical analysis of how we arrived at the point that we are today, and be willing to have these difficult or uncomfortable conversations if we want to improve the integrity of our criminal justice system.
Yeah, and I want to go to you, Mr. Green. David Youngblood writes in, he says, there is no goodwill in trying to have a conversation. He says, we must rely on our own insistence to force change. Your thoughts on that, Mr. Green?
I believe that is a true statement, but I believe we also have to have real conversations with our people about our place in this criminal justice system, about our place in our communities, about our responsibility in politics. I think we can't move forward without first having those conversations. But I wholeheartedly agree with what he's saying. We have to be action oriented, but we have to have a conversation on which actions we're going to take and how we're going to move together.
Yeah, and so in summation, and I know you hear that a lot, Attorney Rice. In summation, the best course of action for African Americans when it comes to standing your ground, because standing your ground, I think we've decided it's not a law for us.
Yeah, I would just say that, to echo some of the things the other panelists have said, it's just be careful in understanding how the biases will impact how the law is applied to you. Understand that first. If you find yourself in a situation where you have, defended yourself, then, always, respect your Fifth Amendment right, to not incriminate yourself. I think that that's a very important thing to do, is to speak to an attorney first before, you give a statement. I just met so many people who have such this, and maybe it is based on the recent history of electing a first African-American president, but so many people have this expectation that, they give the information to a detective or to an officer, and they want to tell their whole story, right away. And they feel like that'll vindicate them. and they really don't understand the mechanisms of this criminal system and how that information will necessarily be used to prosecute you. So, that's kind of some hindsight information there if you find yourself in that position. But otherwise, what I would say is just keep in mind that we all do have a right to defend ourselves based on common law, self-defense. Stand your ground law has codified that in statutory form and imposed this additional ability to not have to retreat in certain situations. But I would just, remind folks to be cautious in those situations and just understand that there may be a heightened standard for African Americans, but at the same time, you do still have the right to defend yourself if you do have a reasonable belief that you are in danger or that, someone near you is in danger as well.
And real quick, what you just said there, I want to go back just a moment because you talked about the right to remain silent. Just briefly explain, particularly, and I've been saying this for a long time because I've seen so many things at covering court cases and things of that nature. How important is that right for Black America?
I tell you what, it's everything. It's everything because in so many cases, the investigators have a job to do. They have a duty to go out and collect information, and they can only collect information from the witnesses. And then there may sometimes be other tangible scientific information that they can collect as well. But I think it's a basic, human nature type of response to want to be able to just share your story right away with the first person you speak to. And you have this expectation that if you're completely honest and transparent, everything is going to work out. But in a lot of cases, nothing could be further from the truth. And you need to make sure that the information you present is presented in the right way, not based on how you feel and your emotions, but based on a professional's evaluation of the facts of your case. And that is not to imply any type of dishonesty or anything like that. That's just to say that a prosecutor's job is to prosecute, and some district attorneys want to obtain convictions, and they believe that the quality of their work is determined based on the number of convictions that they can obtain, notwithstanding whether or not there is a legitimate reason that force was used or deadly force was used in that situation. And so it's just imperative that if you're in that situation, that you just ask for an attorney, and you're not making yourself look guilty in those situations by asking for an attorney. It's a prudent decision that's just based on objective data in these types of cases.
Yeah, you have a right to once you have that encounter with law enforcement, that's one of the protections, right? Dr. Houston, you have a right to remain silent. Exercise that right, right? I think you're on mute, Dr. Houston.
I absolutely agree. I operate under the assumption that they assume I'm guilty. So I don't look at them as doing me any favors. So what I need to do is to make sure that I have a professional and all the I's are dotted, everything is up to par. Because again, the assumption is not that I am innocent until proven guilty. History has shown is typically the opposite for African Americans, particularly Black men. So it's almost as if you have a target on your back and you spend most of your life trying to erase that target. So do the best you can to stay out of harm's way. But when it happens, be prepared and always make sure that you have all the information. As the attorney on the panelist has said, know the law as best you can and get somebody who knows it better than you to represent you in the courts.
Yeah, and just real quick, Chevy Lassiter at the Washington Informer writes in that check out the teens fighting at the mall. Yeah, we did do that as a news topic earlier, Chevy. You're absolutely right. The Black one violently handcuffed and the white teen told calmly to sit down. We know this continues to happen. I want to give Mr. Green the last word here. Mr. Green, 30 seconds or less. Your closing thought. I think he's muted. Mr. Green?
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
My closing thought is just be careful. We are not wanted in this land, so just be careful. And we have to come together and be careful together.
Absolutely. Dr. Akin Houston, the Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies at Ohio University, Attorney Richard Wright of the Rice Firm in Alabama, and Ray Green Jr., the Executive Director of the Freedom Block in Akron. We really thank you guys this morning for joining us, and we thank you all for tuning in to Let It Be Known. We will see you tomorrow.